In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there was a young boy named Jamal. He was an 11-year-old boy who always tried to be kind to everyone he met. Jamal lived with his family in a small but cozy house just down the street from Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Jamal had often seen Mrs. Johnson sitting on her front porch enjoying the sunshine. He had always thought she looked a little lonely, but he never thought much about it. One sunny afternoon, Jamal was walking home from school when he noticed Mrs. Johnson standing near her front porch, looking at something on the ground. It appeared that she was trying to fix a light bulb but couldn't quite reach it. She was trying to climb a small ladder, but her age made it difficult. Jamal could see that she was struggling, and without hesitation, he decided to help. "Hi, Mrs. Johnson. Do you need help with the light?" Jamal asked, standing on the sidewalk in front of her house. Mrs. Johnson turned around, surprised to see the young boy standing there. At first, she hesitated, not sure if she should accept help from him. But after a moment, she smiled and nodded. "Oh, thank you, Jamal. That would be so kind of you," she said, her voice soft. Jamal quickly walked up to the porch and reached for the ladder. He carefully climbed up, unscrewing the old light bulb and replacing it with a new one. Mrs. Johnson watched, a look of relief on her face as the light flickered on. "Thank you so much, Jamal. I don't know what I would have done without you," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice filled with gratitude. Jamal smiled and waved it off. "No problem, Mrs. Johnson. I'm happy to help," he replied. He could see the genuine appreciation in her eyes, and that made him feel good inside. Before he left, Mrs. Johnson insisted on giving him a small token of thanks. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a few dollars, offering it to Jamal. But Jamal shook his head. "No, Mrs. Johnson, I'm just happy to help you. You don't need to give me anything," he said politely. Mrs. Johnson looked at him for a moment, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Well, you're a very kind young man, Jamal. Thank you again." With a final wave, Jamal turned around and headed back home, feeling proud of his simple act of kindness. It was moments like this that made him feel good inside, knowing he had made someone's day a little brighter. But Jamal didn't know that this small act would soon lead to an unexpected turn of events. He would never have guessed that his simple, good deed would be misunderstood and cause him so much trouble in the days that followed. The story was only just beginning, and Jamal's life was about to change in ways he could never have predicted. The next morning, Jamal woke up early for school. He was excited because it was Friday, and he had made plans to meet up with his friends after school. As he got ready, he thought back to the day before. Helping Mrs. Johnson had felt really good, and he was glad that he could make her day easier. He couldn't wait to share the story with his friends, but he didn't expect what would happen next. After school, Jamal was walking home when he noticed a couple of police cars parked outside his house. His heart skipped a beat, and he started walking faster. As he got closer, he could see his mother talking to two officers on the front porch. He had never seen the police at his house before, and it made him nervous. "Mom, what's going on?" Jamal asked, his voice shaking slightly. His mother turned to him, looking a little concerned but trying to stay calm. "Jamal, what happened yesterday with Mrs. Johnson?" "The police are here because she called them." Jamal's eyes widened in confusion. "What? Why would she call the police? I was just helping her with her light." Before his mother could answer, one of the officers approached Jamal. He was a tall, stern-looking man with a serious expression. "Are you Jamal?" he asked in a firm voice. Jamal nodded, still not understanding why the police were involved. "Yes, sir. What's going on?" The officer cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Johnson reported that you were acting suspiciously around her house yesterday. She said she didn't recognize you and was worried about you being near her porch." Jamal's stomach dropped. "But I was just helping her with a light. I didn't mean any harm." The officer didn't seem convinced. "Mrs. Johnson told us you didn't give her a chance to explain herself before you went up on the ladder and started touching things on her property. She said you wouldn't listen when she asked you to stop. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had only tried to help. He looked at his mother for support, but she looked just as confused as he felt. "Mom, I told her I was just trying to help," Jamal said, his voice soft and pleading. His mother nodded, trying to stay calm in front of the officers. "Jamal is a good boy. He would never do anything to harm anyone." Mrs. Johnson must have misunderstood. But the officers weren't so sure. One of them turned to the other and muttered something under his breath about the problem with kids these days. Jamal felt a pang of frustration. Why wasn't anyone listening to him? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers sighed. "We'll need to talk to Mrs. Johnson again. We'll be in touch," he said before walking back to his car. As the police cars drove away, Jamal's mother put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll sort this out, Jamal. I know you didn't do anything wrong." But inside, Jamal was confused and hurt. He had been nothing but kind to Mrs. Johnson, and now he was being accused of something he didn't do. He couldn't understand how a small act of kindness had turned into such a big problem. His world had suddenly become much more complicated, and he didn't know how to fix it. The next few days were the hardest Jamal had ever faced. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened with Mrs. Johnson and the police. He had always been the kind of kid who helped others without expecting anything in return, but now he was caught in a situation that seemed so unfair. At school, Jamal kept to himself. His friends noticed he was quieter than usual, but he didn't want to talk about what had happened. It felt like the whole situation was too complicated to explain, and he didn't want anyone to think he had done something wrong. He just wanted things to go back to normal. Then, on Monday, things took an unexpected turn. It was around lunchtime when Jamal's phone rang. He had been sitting at his usual table, picking at his food, when the phone vibrated in his pocket. Surprised, he pulled it out and saw that it was his mom calling. "Hello," he answered, trying to sound calm. "Jamal, I need you to come home right now." His mom's voice was tense and urgent. "Mom, what happened?" Jamal asked, his stomach sinking. Was something else wrong? "I don't want to explain it over the phone, but Mrs. Johnson called again," his mom said. "She's saying some things that aren't true, and I need you to be here when we talk to her." Jamal felt a wave of anxiety hit him. Why was she calling again? What else could she say that would make things worse? "I'm coming, Mom. I'll be there soon," he said, hanging up quickly. He grabbed his bag and rushed out of the lunchroom, hardly noticing his friends calling out to him. His mind was racing with questions. What was Mrs. Johnson saying now? Why couldn't she just understand that he was trying to help? When Jamal arrived home, his mother was waiting for him by the front door. She looked serious, but also a bit exhausted. "We need to talk," she said softly, leading him inside. They went into the living room, and Jamal sat down, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I spoke with Mrs. Johnson, and it didn't go well," his mom said, sitting across from him. "She insists you were acting suspiciously, and that she was frightened. She even told the police that you had been trying to break into her house." Jamal's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? That's not true. I was just fixing the light outside her house." "I know, sweetheart," his mom said, her voice soft but filled with concern. "But she's convinced that you had bad intentions." Jamal shook his head, frustrated. "I can't believe this. I don't know why she's doing this." His mom paused for a moment before speaking again. "I called the police and explained everything. They're going to review the situation, and we're going to meet with them tomorrow. I'll make sure they know you didn't do anything wrong." But even as she said the words, Jamal could see the doubt in her eyes. She was trying to reassure him, but deep down, she seemed worried too. Jamal didn't know what to think anymore. He hadn't meant to cause trouble, but now it seemed like the more he tried to help, the worse things got. As the day went on, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why had Mrs. Johnson turned against him after he'd only tried to help? Was it because of the way he looked, or was it something else? He couldn't help but feel like he was being blamed for something he didn't deserve. The next day was going to be crucial. Jamal just hoped that the truth would come out soon. The next morning, Jamal felt a tight knot in his stomach as he walked with his mom to the police station. His mind was filled with so many thoughts, none of them good. Why had Mrs. Johnson made these false accusations? Jamal had only been trying to do a good deed, fixing her light. He never imagined that it would lead to such a mess. As they entered the police station, Jamal's mom squeezed his hand. "Stay calm, Jamal," she said softly. "We'll sort this out. The truth will come out." Jamal nodded, though his nerves were getting the best of him. He had never been in a situation like this before. The idea that someone would accuse him of something he didn't do was terrifying. He'd heard of things like this happening to others, but never thought it would happen to him. They were led into a small room where two officers were waiting. One of them, a middle-aged man with a stern look, stood up as they entered. "Good morning," he said in a polite but businesslike tone. "I'm Officer Thomas. Please have a seat." Jamal and his mom sat down at the table, and Officer Thomas began to speak. "We've spoken to Mrs. Johnson, and she's told us a very different story about what happened that day," Officer Thomas explained. "She says you were seen near her house, acting suspiciously, and that you may have tried to break into her property." Jamal's heart raced as he listened. "But that's not true. I was just fixing the light outside her house. She asked me to help," he said, his voice shaking with frustration. Officer Thomas looked at Jamal with a serious expression. "We'll get to the facts. But you have to understand, she's made some very serious claims, and we need to investigate everything thoroughly." Jamal felt a lump in his throat. He could see how serious the officer was, but all he wanted was for them to believe him. He didn't want to be in trouble for something he hadn't done. "Jamal, tell the officer what happened." "Start from the beginning," his mom said gently, trying to calm him down. Taking a deep breath, Jamal began to explain everything, starting with how he had noticed the broken light in Mrs. Johnson's yard and how he had offered to help. He told them about how Mrs. Johnson had seemed grateful at first, but after he had fixed the light, she had become upset and told him to leave. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I was just trying to help." Officer Thomas nodded thoughtfully, but his face was still serious. "We'll need to speak with Mrs. Johnson again, and we'll review any evidence. For now, I suggest you stay at home and don't go near her property." Jamal felt a mix of relief and anxiety. At least the police were going to investigate the situation further. But what if Mrs. Johnson kept lying? What if the police didn't believe him? Before they left the room, Officer Thomas gave Jamal a look. "We'll contact you if we need more information. Stay patient." As Jamal and his mom left the police station, he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the truth finally come out? Or would he be caught in a situation where no one believed him? One thing was clear. He wasn't going to give up. He had done nothing wrong, and he was determined to prove it. Days passed after the police visit, and Jamal felt like he was stuck in a nightmare. He couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Johnson's accusations. The memory of her angry words still lingered in his mind. He had done nothing wrong, yet she had made it sound like he was a criminal. Every time Jamal went outside, he wondered if anyone was watching him, thinking he was guilty of something he wasn't. Even though the police had said they would investigate, it felt like everything was out of his control. His friends at school noticed he seemed off, but he didn't feel like talking to anyone about it. What was there to say? One afternoon, while Jamal was sitting on the front porch, trying to get some fresh air, his mom came out with a phone in her hand. She was smiling, which was a big relief to him. Her smile always made him feel a little less anxious. "Jamal," she said, "I just got off the phone with Officer Thomas. It looks like things are finally moving forward." Jamal sat up, his heart beating faster. "What do you mean? What happened?" "Well," his mom said, sitting next to him, "the police spoke with a neighbor who saw what happened. They saw you and Mrs. Johnson talking by her light, and they said they didn't hear any argument or anything that would suggest you were doing anything wrong. Jamal's eyes widened. So they believe me? His mom nodded. Yes, but there's more. The officer spoke to Mrs. Johnson again, and it turns out she was upset because of something personal in her life. She took it out on you. Jamal couldn't believe what he was hearing. She lied about me because of something going on with her, he asked, shaking his head in disbelief. I'm afraid so, his mom replied. She admitted that she overreacted, and it wasn't your fault. Jamal felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. Finally, after all this time, the truth was coming out. He hadn't done anything wrong. But even though he felt relief, there was still a part of him that couldn't understand why Mrs. Johnson had done what she did. As the days passed, things slowly went back to normal. Mrs. Johnson apologized to Jamal, and though it wasn't easy for him to forgive her right away, he understood that people sometimes make mistakes when they're under pressure. He realized that forgiveness didn't just help others, it helped him too. Jamal's parents were proud of how he handled the whole situation. They knew it wasn't easy for him, but he had stayed strong and had trusted in the truth. It was a hard lesson to learn, but Jamal knew that standing up for what was right was always worth it. The next week, things felt different. Jamal didn't feel like people were looking at him with suspicion anymore. He had earned back his confidence and peace of mind. And although he had helped Mrs. Johnson, he had also learned something important about standing up for himself and trusting that the truth would always come to light. His life had returned to normal, but Jamal would always remember this experience. It taught him the power of truth and the importance of never backing down when you know you've done the right thing. He knew that in the future, he would face challenges, but he was ready for them. He would stand firm, no matter what. The weeks following the incident felt like a turning point for Jamal. He was no longer afraid to walk through his neighborhood, no longer worried about people whispering behind his back. Word spread quickly that Mrs. Johnson had made a mistake and had wrongly accused him. Even some of the adults in the neighborhood started to approach Jamal with more respect. He began to feel proud of how he handled the situation, but he knew that there was still work to be done. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about understanding why people, like Mrs. Johnson, made judgments without knowing the full story. Jamal had always been kind-hearted, but he knew that not everyone was as forgiving as he had been. One afternoon, as Jamal was walking home from school, he passed Mrs. Johnson's house. She was standing outside, looking at the flowers she had planted in her garden. When she saw him walking by, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Jamal," she called, her voice hesitant. "Can we talk for a moment?" Jamal stopped, unsure of what to expect. "Sure," he said, his arms crossed in front of him. Mrs. Johnson looked down at her shoes for a moment before meeting his eyes. "I want to apologize again for what happened. I shouldn't have acted that way. It was unfair to you, and I've been feeling guilty about it ever since." Jamal nodded but didn't say anything right away. He wasn't sure how to feel. Mrs. Johnson had caused him so much stress, but he knew that forgiveness was an important part of healing. "It's okay," he said finally. "I understand. People make mistakes, and I know that now. I just wish you had talked to me first instead of going straight to the police." "I know," she said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry. I let my fears get the best of me. You didn't deserve that." Jamal smiled, not in anger, but in understanding. "It's all right. Just remember next time, don't judge someone too quickly." Mrs. Johnson smiled back. "I'll do better. Thank you for being so kind." As Jamal walked away from her house, he felt a sense of closure. He realized that the lesson he had learned was not just about standing up for himself, but about having the strength to forgive and the wisdom to understand that everyone had their own struggles. He knew that everyone deserved to be treated fairly, no matter who they were or what they had been through. The next day, when Jamal arrived at school, he couldn't help but notice how people were looking at him differently. His classmates seemed more respectful, and even his teachers smiled when they saw him. Jamal had always been the kid who helped others, who gave his best no matter the situation. But now he felt like his actions had truly earned him the respect of those around him. He wasn't the same boy who had once been uncertain and anxious. Now, Jamal had learned how to stand up for himself, how to face adversity with grace, and how to show empathy for others, even when they hadn't shown it to him. In the end, Jamal's experience with Mrs. Johnson had taught him one of the most important lessons of all. Kindness, understanding, and courage could change the world. And he knew that, no matter what happened in the future, he was ready to face it with strength and an open heart. You said. The weeks following the incident felt like a turning point for Jamal. He was no longer afraid to walk through his neighborhood, no longer worried about people whispering behind his back. Word spread quickly that Mrs. Johnson had made a mistake and had wrongly accused him. Even some of the adults in the neighborhood started to approach Jamal with more respect. He began to feel proud of how he handled the situation, but he knew that there was still work to be done. It wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about understanding why people, like Mrs. Johnson, made judgments without knowing the full story. Jamal had always been kind-hearted, but he knew that not everyone was as forgiving as he had been. One afternoon, as Jamal was walking home from school, he passed Mrs. Johnson's house. She was standing outside, looking at the flowers she had planted in her garden. When she saw him walking by, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Jamal," she called, her voice hesitant. "Can we talk for a moment?" Jamal stopped, unsure of what to expect. "Sure," he said, his arms crossed in front of him. Mrs. Johnson looked down at her shoes for a moment before meeting his eyes. "I want to apologize again for what happened. I shouldn't have acted that way. It was unfair to you, and I've been feeling guilty about it ever since." Jamal nodded but didn't say anything right away. He wasn't sure how to feel. Mrs. Johnson had caused him so much stress, but he knew that forgiveness was an important part of healing. "It's okay," he said finally. "I understand. People make mistakes, and I know that now. I just wish you had talked to me first, instead of going straight to the police." "I know," she said, her voice soft. "I'm sorry. I let my fears get the best of me. You didn't deserve that." Jamal smiled, not in anger, but in understanding. "It's all right. Just remember next time, don't judge someone too quickly." Mrs. Johnson smiled back. "I'll do better. Thank you for being so kind." As Jamal walked away from her house, he felt a sense of closure. He realized that the lesson he had learned was not just about standing up for himself, but about having the strength to forgive and the wisdom to understand that everyone had their own struggles. He knew that everyone deserved to be treated fairly, no matter who they were or what they had been through. The next day, when Jamal arrived at school, he couldn't help but notice how people were looking at him differently. His classmates seemed more respectful, and even his teachers smiled when they saw him. Jamal had always been the kid who helped others, who gave his best no matter the situation. But now he felt like his actions had truly earned him the respect of those around him. He wasn't the same boy who had once been uncertain and anxious. Now, Jamal had learned how to stand up for himself, how to face adversity with grace, and how to show empathy for others, even when they hadn't shown it to him. In the end, Jamal's experience with Mrs. Johnson had taught him one of the most important lessons of all. Kindness, understanding, and courage could change the world. And he knew that, no matter what happened in the future, he was ready to face it with strength and an open heart. You said.